Speaker. Thank you.
The time for this debate has expired. I call on Government Orders of the Day numbers 1 to 3.
Resource Legislation Amendment Bill, Committee Stage continued. Fire and Emergency New Zealand Bill, Committee Stage continued. Māori Purposes Bill, Committee Stage continued.
I declare the House in committee for further consideration of the Resource Legislation Amendment Bill, the Fire and Emergency New Zealand Bill and the Māori Purposes Bill. Mr Chairman.
Mr Speaker.
Members, the House and Committee on the Resource Legislation Amendment Bill, the Fire and Emergency New Zealand Bill and the Māori Purposes Bill. We come first to the Resource Legislation Amendment Bill. When we were last considering the bill, the committee had concluded its consideration of Part 1. We therefore move on to Part 2. What? The question is that Part 2 stand part. Those are of that opinion?
Mr Chair.
Wood.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Excuse my tentative standing there. I shall aim to improve. Mr Chair, I'd be very happy to take a call on part... I remember the wise words of former Assistant Speaker Ross Robertson, who said, courtesy is contagious, Mr Chair. I'm always hopeful, Mr Chair. And of course, Mr Chair, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about this bill and the capacity of this House to look at improvements to it in this committee stage as well. And it's in that vein that I rise to speak about Part 2, which refers to a number of changes to the Reserves Act. And of course, we sort of had the main act in terms of the Resource Legislation Bill yesterday. A lot of the significant changes that have attracted a great deal of public attention were in the earlier part, but it is nonetheless important that we also give scrutiny to the subsequent parts. And I personally feel very strongly about this part too. I've got a background in local government over the past 6 years, and one of the things that I've learned in that time is the importance and the preciousness of our parks and our open spaces, the reserves that make our cities and towns good places to live, to experience recreation, to provide protection to important ecological areas and wildlife. And the fact is that we often have those reserves because of the legislative protections that we have in the Reserves Act. And so I've just got the purpose here of the Reserves Act, which I think is useful to reflect upon when we're looking at these possible changes here. And Part 3A of that Act describes the purpose as providing for the preservation and management for the benefit and enjoyment of the public, areas of New Zealand possessing recreational use or potential, wildlife or indigenous flora or fauna, or environmental and landscape amenity or natural, scenic, historic, cultural, archaeological, biological, geological, scientific, educational, community or other special features or value. And so, sir, we turn to the bill under consideration and what it actually does in this area. And effectively what it does is to give the option of considering and consulting upon Reserves Act exchanges alongside plan changes. That's effectively what we're talking about here. And this does deserve some scrutiny, sir. And there are a number of submissions which pointed to some of the potential issues that come to the fore when we bring those two things together. And essentially, sir, the problem and the issue and the reason why the Labour Party has a problem in this area is if we go back to that purpose of the Reserves Act that I talked about, and then we look at the underlying objectives of this Act, which are effectively to encourage and support development. Those two objectives do not necessarily line up well. Now, under the Reserves Act that we have and the body of jurisprudence that is built up under it, there is always a fundamental and strong protection and interest in the reserve itself, and always making Reserves Act decisions, especially in relation to exchanges under the Reserves Act, with the benefit of the reserve at the very centre. And so the question, sir, is that if under this bill, under this amendment, and we're talking here about the changes to Section 14A of the Reserves Act, we potentially confuse and dilute the two purposes there. Because if you're running the two processes together, that is questions about whether it is appropriate to exchange reserve land and plan changes, which are almost inevitably about developing upon the subsequent land that has come about as a result of the exchange, how do you preserve the primacy of the interests of the reserve when you're running those two processes together? Because if you look at the current process, we first go through a Reserves Act exchange process, and that gives us the opportunity to say, is this exchange of reserve land appropriate? Is it in the interests of the reserve land and the community that it serves? Now, the answer might very well be, yes, it is. And in that case, you can potentially then move on to the plan change process and look at development on that land. But, sir, I can only think that putting those two processes together puts additional pressure on the decision makers to think about the potential development when actually what we should be focusing on in the first place is the Reserve Act, the land that we're considering under the Reserves Act. And so I've got real concerns here, and these concerns were reflected, sir, in some of the commentary around the bill and some of the submissions. And I refer, sir, Mr. Chair.
Before I go to Mr. O'Rourke, I am going to remind the committee that we are talking to Part 2 and we're talking to what's actually in Part 2 now, not what might have been in it earlier. We're talking to Part 2 as amended and any amendments to it, but there aren't any yet. So it's a very narrow area and doesn't actually even include the clauses that the member's referring to, which were changed at the Select Committee. Dennis O'Rourke.
Could I, just a point of order there, Mr. Chair.